This video will inevitably include spoilers for stories in Final Fantasy XIV at varying levels of progression. It is generally accepted that the entirety of the MSQ is incredibly easy and that it would be unbelievable if a player actually quit because they couldn't beat it. At least to some players this is true. Personally, I have never had trouble beating a main quest relevant task. However, there are certainly some particular high points in difficulty, and I wanted to highlight some of these. To be clear, this is of course just my opinion on what is hard, and this list will simultaneously include solo duties, as well as dungeons and trials with other players. However, if there are other players, I will emphasize the difficulty based on how much you yourself have to do for the group as a whole to succeed. For example, if a fight has a DPS check, but your participation in said DPS check isn't actually necessary to beat it, then it isn't considered difficult for you. If, on the other hand, your participation is mandatory to beat it, then it qualifies as a challenge relevant for the MSQ specifically. I will also choose to ignore the fact that solo duties have easy and very easy difficulty settings, simply because you need to fail the encounter itself to even be offered them, which itself gives credence to the difficulty of the solo duty. And also, it's not like many of these solo duties can't be entirely skipped by buying a story skip anyway, so I will simply not count that. Number 10. Literally any mandatory sneaking mission in Endwalker. While these aren't like mechanically challenging in their own right, the simple fact that they have this instant failure condition attached to them in a game that is not really about sneaking, without clear indicators for what is considered hidden and where exactly the target's vision cone is, can make this feel weirdly impossible to overcome for some players. I've not met anyone that was stopped in their tracks entirely by a quest like this, however. Number 9. In Crimson it began. The first fight with Zenos. A solo fight with a significant amount of boss mechanics that can absolutely overwhelm you if you fall out of position. Now, you might be thinking, there's way harder dungeon bosses before this. But the key difference here is that some players might have skirted through those encounters by being carried by their team, or alternatively by being raised a few times throughout. This is not an option in a solo duty, meaning that the minimum skill required is increased significantly. It of course does not really help that when you finally win, the game turns around on you and goes, "Good, you entertained him enough," but you still lose. Number 8. Porta Decumana, the Ultima weapon. I know this one might seem absolutely ridiculous, however, with the rework of the Ultima weapon fight, the second part of it, after the well-known quote, the Ultima weapon is actually quite challenging in its own right. It includes non-telegraphed attacks like the Citadel Buster and a lot of both avoidable and unavoidable damage. Just a lot of new stuff in a way. Even if your group does everything right, there's a reasonable chance that the healer will have to cast a bunch of healing. This also means that if your group is not capable of this fight can feel impossible. It also finishes with a DPS check that you are supposed to use your limit break for. However, in such a time-limited situation, it isn't unlikely that a Sprout would have no time to figure out how to do that. Number 7. The new reworked Lahabrea fight after Ultima weapon. As another solo duty with a lot of mechanics, this one can similarly be a step up in difficulty just like the Zenos fight. Most of the telegraphs give you plenty of time to move though, so as long as you don't repeatedly get hit, you should be fine. The fight also has an intentionally unbeatable DPS check, and I'm not sure if it matters if you even try, since you are raised afterwards and the fight continues. You might be thinking right now, I feel like all these fights are weirdly not that challenging despite being on a list like this. And yeah, you're probably right. For the most part, the MSQ is not that hard. That's a bit of the point. Anyway, let's continue. Number 6. Operation Archon, Cape Westwind Reworked, also known as the fight with Rhitahtyn's Ascian. Entirely similar to the Lahabrea fight in that it is simply a lot of mechanics, but different in the way that this one comes first, and is the earliest example of a properly challenging solo duty that you could absolutely fail. Some of the mechanics in the fight also have very little reaction time, which also makes the fight more difficult. This can be further emphasized if you happen to play a DPS that doesn't have much access to self-healing, as Rhitahtyn is very capable of keeping pace with its passive healing from your solo duty buff. What really makes this fight stand out is that it has more punishing and difficult mechanics than most bosses in dungeons prior to this point in the story. Number 5. Seed of Sacrifice. Indeed, the boss begins with a hefty heal check, and after the intermission, a tank is expected to use Limit Break, or you lose. However, both of these can be made easier by the rest of your group. If you are a DPS going through the MSQ, you can do very little about them. And even if you are a healer or a tank, your co-tank or co-healer can very likely cover for what you can't do. Hence why solo duties often can be viewed as more challenging. However, speaking of solo duty, the intermission itself includes a button mash section, and if you fail, your group wipes. Meaning, everyone has to succeed. No button mashing section prior to this has required this. At worst, you died if you failed it in all prior cases. I've personally been in groups where someone failed this specific part multiple times. Number 4. A Frosty Reception, also known as This is Thancred, the sneaking mission king, you'd think. Sneaking missions in Final Fantasy XIV are automatically at least partly increased in difficulty simply because, as I mentioned, it is such an uncommon part of the game. This one is made slightly easier by Thancred having straight up invisibility when having to approach packs. But then again, is made more challenging by the solo duty being rather long and many enemies being able to detect invisibility. While you can just go up and bonk the enemies a few times, you have to eventually play ball in this specific duty. This can be quite challenging for some players. Number 3. Death unto Dawn, the final solo duty of Shadowbringers. This duty is made difficult by the simple fact that you have to play healer multiple times throughout the duty. Furthermore, there's also a part where you have to use an interrupt. The fact that you're tossed between different NPCs multiple times also means that this solo duty involves learning and remembering a decently large selection of actions just for this one quest. The difficulty of this duty can be even greater if the particular player doesn't know how healing really works, or if they have never understood interrupts, given that both are required to proceed. Number 2. In from the Cold. A rather long solo duty focused on being careful and sneaking around, which sort of plays like a weird adventure puzzle in a way. That alone sounds pretty okay. However, you have a rather strict time limit considering how long the duty is. And, as I mentioned before, sneaking missions are just not common in Final Fantasy XIV. This one specifically forces you to understand how side cones work and what aggroes mobs. I think the last time anyone actually cared about that aspect of the game was when people talked about the fact that you can skip the first room in Aurum Vale by walking carefully through the room. That's a long time ago, and it isn't even something players really use. It's just a fun fact. Number 1. Endwalker. Specifically, the final battle with Zenos. This fight is clearly intended to be very difficult, or at least tuned to be very mean in a way, given that the game gives you 5 extra lives. You might think, wait, doesn't that give me 6? And you would be right. However, in the transition to the final phase of the fight, Zenos just kills you. So you need 1 in stock for that. This fight is of course intentionally tuned to be challenging as a grand finale of the 10-year-long story of Final Fantasy XIV. And with that, I want to add a few honorable mentions in no particular order. The first is Dancing Plague, the fight with Titania. While she doesn't specifically give an individual a huge amount of responsibility, the intermission itself is strict enough on the DPS check that it is not an uncommon sight to see it actually fail if too many players die throughout. For the second honorable mention, the Chrysalis. A weird fight, but specifically the intermission, again, can be really mean. It is tuned tightly because when you enter this intermission, all buffs you have get a huge extension to their length. So, if you use all your defensive cooldowns and offensive cooldowns, they will typically last the whole time you're in there. However, you need to know that before you enter to make use of this. The alternative approach, which might be the intended approach, is to use a melee limit break 3 on the fissure that appears. However, if no one does that, then your only other recourse is to make sure you already have your buffs. A very mean encounter indeed. For the third honorable mention, the Reworked Aetherochemical Research Facility, or ARF. The final boss especially has a lot of mean mechanics that can easily stop you in your tracks. In a way, I sometimes think the old version of the fight was even meaner. Regardless, the fight also has a somewhat strict DPS check, and that can surprise an individual player with more responsibility than they're used to. With that said, do you feel that I got the order wrong? Maybe you feel I forgot an encounter? What duties do you feel were the hardest mandatory encounters in the main scenario quest? I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, the old Cape Westwind was a laughingstock due to how easy it was. However, this is mainly because, due to a weirdly lenient sync, you could beat the fight before any significant mechanic happened. If you had a group of undergeared players, or even did it at minimum item level, you'd find that the boss had quite a lot of difficult and punishing mechanics. This isn't the only time this has happened, and is actually often a regularly recurring problem, that item level sometimes completely trivializes something that was supposed to be hard.